Good evening. We will now get started with tonight's program. Thank you for joining us as we host another installment of the East Asia by the Book CEAS Author Talk series, sponsored by the University of Chicago's Center for East Asian Studies. My name is Paul Kopp, and I am Associate Professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations here at the University of Chicago. For more information on the University of Chicago's Center for East Asian Studies and the East Asia by the Book CEAS Author Talk series, please visit the CEAS website and subscribe to receive weekly outreach emails. These links will be provided in the chat box. Tonight's program is co-sponsored with the Seminary Co-op Bookstore, the Center's long-term partner, and the first not-for-profit bookstore whose mission is bookselling. We are encouraging book sales for this event to be made through the Seminary Co-op. And although the stores remain closed to the public, they are fulfilling orders through their website. We encourage viewers to visit their website and help support this unique cultural institution. The event is also co-sponsored with the Committee on Southern Asian Studies, which provides and supports faculty research, student fellowships, UChicago's rich South Asia archive, and programming events on Southern Asia. Learn more about the Committee on Southern Asian Studies and the Seminary Co-op by following the links being provided in the chat box. A link to purchase tonight's book will also be made available. Following the end of tonight's presentation, we will have a Q&A session. To ask a question to be addressed during tonight's Q&A portion of the program, please be sure to type in your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So let me now introduce our speakers this evening. Xue Fei Ren received her PhD in sociology here at the University and is currently in the Department of Sociology at Michigan State University. She is a comparative urbanist whose work focuses on urban development, governance, architecture, and the built environment in global perspective. Aside from the book she will talk about tonight, which is of course Governing the Urban in China and India, Land Grabs, Slum Clearance, and the War on Air Pollution. She is also the author of Urban China and Building Globalization, Transnational Architecture Production in China. Currently, she is working on several comparative projects on urban redevelopment concerning China, India, Brazil, and the US, mega events, Beijing, Tokyo, and the Rio Olympics, and culture-led revitalization in post-industrial cities such as Detroit, Harbin, and Turin. Marco Garrido is associate professor in the Department of Sociology here at the University of Chicago. His work has focused on the relationship between the urban poor and middle class in Manila as located in slums and upper and middle class enclaves. He is the author of The Patchwork City, Class, Space, and Politics in Metro Manila. And we're very grateful to have him here with us this evening, and grateful to have both of them. So let me turn it over to Xue Fei now.
Okay, thank you, Paul, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for organizing the program tonight. So the idea of comparing cities in China and India was actually conceived right here in Hyde Park more than 10 years ago when I was a PhD student in the sociology program at the University of Chicago. So in the summer, after I finished my dissertation, I had a lot of free time and I was looking for the next project. And I was looking for something different, very different from my dissertation work. And at that time, I had a good friend and classmate, also a classmate of mine, Liza Weinstein. She was writing her dissertation in India. So we had a few conversations and then decided to collaborate. That's how I began to work and write about urban India. And for the last 10 years, I've made many trips to different parts of India. I traveled across the country from Chandigarh to Kerala, from Delhi to Chennai, Bangalore. So I've seen probably more cities and what I know about than the places I've been to in China. So at some point, I decided to write a book and more systematically compare the urban issues in the countries. So that's how the project came along. So today, let me begin by giving you a very brief overview of the urban trajectory of these two very large and complex countries. I'll start with China. Last year, in 2020, more than 60% of China's population lived in cities and towns. So that's the official urbanization rate. And that's a very high number compared to, for example, 10 years ago, the number was probably 45%. So China's been urbanizing at a very aggressive pace. And the main mechanism or the main driver for China's very rapid urban population growth is migration, especially rural to urban migration. China has almost close to 300 million migrant workers, and most of them are rural to urban migrants. So migration is the big story behind China's urbanization drive. And for India, it's a bit different. First of all, if you look at the official statistics, only 34% of India's population is urban, according to the last census. But that number can be very misleading because for different reasons, India, Census Bureau of India has been using for almost half a century a very strict and narrow definition for counting what is urban. And India has many small urbanized places, and these are counted as rural by the Census Bureau. So a lot of scholars, especially urban geographers, speculate that the actual urbanization rate of India is actually somewhere between 40% and 65%. So when we compare the official statistics, so 60% versus 34%, the gap is huge. But actually, the gap is probably much smaller than what the census suggests. And very different from China, the main mechanism for India's urban population growth is not migration. Migration is important, but there's something else going on, which is in situ urbanization. So what it means is there are small urbanized towns and small cities in India. The official status of these places is rural, but in these urbanized towns, there are more and more people who leave agriculture and take jobs in manufacturing and services. So that's what in situ urbanization means. And some people estimate that 10 to 15% of India's urban population can be traced to this mechanism, in situ urbanization. So that's the big picture. And for the book project, I'm primarily interested in just one big question, which is what's the difference? How do these two countries differently govern their city? And my thesis is this territorial versus associational approach to governing urban affairs. So for China, urban governance has a very clear and strong territorial logic. And so by territorial, I can give a couple of examples. So basically it means there's a set of very strong local institutions in cities, and urban policymaking and implementation is shaped by these territorial institutions at the city level. And for India, there's an absence of similar local territorial institutions. And instead, policymaking and implementation is more fluid and also contingent upon coalition building between the public sector, the private sector, and also civil society groups. So, and of course, there are other differences between the two countries, but the one difference I wanted to highlight in the book is this territorial versus associational approach to governing cities and urban affairs. So for the rest of the book project, I looked at three very concrete examples, we can call policy issues, to demonstrate the difference between the territorial and associational logic of urban governance. Not going into the details today, I can just tell you what my three stories are. The first one is on housing, and specifically I compared urban villages, the redevelopment of urban villages in Guangzhou and the redevelopment of slums in Mumbai. And I looked at how the local residents in the informal settlements in these two cities tried to get compensation when their housing, when their community, their neighborhoods get demolished or redeveloped. The second story was on land, especially specifically on land grabs and social movements. So here I interviewed local activists, social movement leaders in two small towns, not cities. I call them small towns. The Chinese case is a land protest in Wukan, which is in the south, in the Pearl River Delta. And then the Indian case study is Singer in the state of West Bengal. And then the last example I used to demonstrate the difference between the territorial and the associational approach to urban governance is air pollution, and specifically air pollution control in Beijing and in Delhi, the two capitals. So in general, one of the goals or one of the things on my agenda was to basically go over the regime type explanation. So a lot of people compare these two countries, China and India, and it's very tempting to conclude that things work differently because China is not a democracy and India is democratic. I'm not disputing the regime type explanation, but I don't think regime types, political regimes explain all the differences. So what I was trying to do with the book project was to explain, for example, how a high capacity and non-democratic country like China actually operates at the local municipal level. And for India, how does, so India is democratic, but also very institutionally fragmented. So how do countries like India manage or govern their urban affairs? And the territorial versus associational approach to urban governance is the main insight I reached over the research for this book. So so I'm not going to talk too long. I'm going to stop here, and I really want to hear first from Marco and then from everybody listening. I want to hear what you think about the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Shufei. It's a pleasure to be asked to discuss your book. And the plan now is for me to make just a few comments, to ask you a few questions, and then to open it up to the audience. So let me begin with some prepared comments. Shufei Ren's ambitious new book, Governing the Urban, represents an achievement. It provides us with a new way of thinking about different forms of governance in China and India. The two countries are usually distinguished by state capacity and political regime. Shufei suggests that we might productively conceive their difference in terms of territorial and associational logics of governance. China primarily governs according to a territorial logic. Its governance is anchored in territorial institutions like hukou, rural collective land ownership, and the cadre evaluation system, Rights, benefits, and resources are distributed according to territorial jurisdictions. Local governments are empowered and possess relative autonomy in pursuing developmental goals. India, on the other hand, primarily governs according to an associational logic, with outcomes largely contingent on alliance building between state, private sector, and civil society actors. These different logics determine policy outcomes, as well as structure different forms of inequality, status divisions, contentious politics, and social mobilization. In the book, Xu Fei discusses how territorial and associational modes of governance play out with respect to three issues: land acquisition, slum clearance, and control of air pollution. The large-scale dispossession of land by state actors working in partnership with private capital is happening in both places. But land grabs are contested in different ways. In China, protesters appeal to the central government and make claims on the basis of collective land ownership, while in India, protesters form ad hoc alliances with political parties and NGOs and make claims on the basis of land laws and basic rights. As for slum clearance, in China, local governments remove illegal construction from urban villages, compensating property owners while evicting migrant tenants. In India, slum rehabilitation programs are quickly politicized. Housing NGOs and political parties enter the fray on the side of slum dwellers and against regional state governments. As for control of air pollution, in China, local governments are held accountable for meeting pollution reduction targets under the target responsibility system. In India, the main actors are environmental NGOs. They mobilize the Supreme Court and media as a way of applying pressure on the local governments. A territorial/associational framework facilitates and enhances our comparative analysis of China and India. Moreover, the systematic comparison of these two giants is itself an achievement. The scale of Xu Fei's project testifies to the extent of her research. The book is in turn ethnographic and historical. In some places, it zooms in to observe protests as they unfold, and in other places, it zooms out to take in decades and even centuries of urban transformation. The book is all the more remarkable as a work of urban sociology, given the field's traditional focus on American urbanism. It serves to rebuke such parochialism and expand the conversation to include very different urban situations in the global South. I am certain that the book will be much discussed and the discussion here. I'd like to start with a few questions to get this discussion going, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So Xu Fei, if I may, my first question is more of an orienting question. And for the purpose of really orienting the audience, it might be helpful to begin by asking you to clarify in specific terms how you see the territorial associational distinction relating to or articulating with other more familiar ways of distinguishing governments in China and India. So as you pointed out, the authoritarian democratic distinction, for instance, what does it add to it? How does it enhance it? How does it help facilitate a comparative view of the two places?
Okay, thank you for the first question. As I said, when people compare these two countries, the most visible common sense difference is regime types. But I think that view is very limiting because political regimes, democracy versus non-democracy, really doesn't explain many quite important differences in the ways the cities in these two countries operate. I can give you an example from my fieldwork. So I was interviewing local residents in Guangzhou in one particular urban village. And let me explain what is an urban village. So these are originally villages in some of them in the city, some of them are on the periphery. And over time, villagers lost land to different municipal projects. And to make a living, they rent out rooms to migrant workers. So most urban villages are migrant, they are settled by migrant workers. So there's one particular urban village in the middle of the central business district. And the city government has been trying to demolish it for almost 20 years from even the late 1990s. And the village is still there. So it's when people think about China, a strong authoritarian regime, how can things like this happen? If the government wants to remove a community, it can be gone overnight. But across the country, there are many, many places like this urban village I studied. So in this particular community, and they've been trying to fight with the municipal government to get fairly compensated. And they are, not everybody, but for those who are entitled to compensation, they are actually winning. They've been very generously compensated. A lot of them have become millionaires because they own a lot of property, and the developers have agreed to compensate their property at the market rate. So I'm using this example to show that when we look at regime types only, perhaps there are just many things we can't understand if we are only focused on democracy versus non-democracy. So that's why for the book project, I wanted to go a little bit deeper and see how things actually work and how issues, conflicts are getting solved or negotiated among different stakeholders, the government, the private sector, and civil society groups. If I can give an example about on the Indian side, so the associational form of approach to urban governance is, I don't think it's only a result of democracy. Of course, democratic regimes are more conducive to alliance building or coalition formation, associational types of politics. But there's something else going on in India, which is the lack or the absence of strong municipal institutions. So at the city level, in almost every city, there's a vacuum of power. Nobody is in control. Nobody has the real power to push policies, make things happen. And therefore, there are many different actors competing for power. So it's the lack of strong municipal institutions that actually gave rise to associational types of politics. So that's how I see my thesis or my approach is different from studies on China and India that focus only on regime types.
I did find that distinction between territorial and associational logics very useful, and was quite persuaded by the concrete chapters where you talked about the specific cases. I wonder though, I wonder if you could talk about how useful this distinction might be beyond the cases, beyond China and India.
Sure. I think in the whole world, in the world of different countries, China and India are probably two extremes. In the two extremes in terms of the power of local government. China has really strong, probably the strongest local governments compared to other countries. And India has the weakest, among the weakest local governments. And most other countries are probably in the middle. If we compare India with, for example, Brazil, South Africa, these two countries, many other developing countries, they have more successfully devolved power from federal state level to the municipal level. But for different historical and institutional reasons, that hasn't happened in India. So as a result, the local institutions, municipal institutions in India, until today, are still very weak. And for other countries, I would say most other countries are in the middle of the spectrum. If I can give an example, so one of my case studies is air pollution. And in Beijing, as Marco just, as you just introduced, summarized my book probably better than I do. So in Beijing, for air pollution campaigns, the main actor is just the municipal government. And for Delhi, the Delhi government hasn't done much. And the main actors are environmental NGOs. So it's the opposite, it's the civil society sector. But in most other countries, for example, in the United States, it's both. So if we look at, for example, Southern California, Los Angeles, which had really poor air quality in the 1980s, 1990s. So what happened in LA was, it's a combination of civil society, environmental NGOs, but also state bureaucracies, and also the private sector, big corporations. So all three sectors worked together to push for clean air legislation. So it's a combination of territorial and associational approach to environmental governance. I think most other countries, except China and India, would fall in this big middle range.
I see.
And I picked two extreme cases.
You make clear in the book that both the territorial and associational forms of governance are ultimately unable to deliver just and equitable urban growth. And yet it's also clear that depending on the issue, one form is more effective than the other. For example, a territorial approach seems to be more effective than the associational one in controlling air pollution, as you pointed out. On the other hand, slum dwellers in India appear to be better protected and have greater recourse than migrant tenants in China. I wondered if you would hazard a general evaluation of the two approaches. Would you say that a territorial approach is generally more effective while an associational approach is generally more inclusive? Or how would you think about the two approaches beyond thinking about them as an analytical distinction? How would you think about them normatively, I guess?
I think we can generalize this way. The territorial approach is more effective, and the associational approach is more inclusive. And we can, I can think of many examples to support this. But at the same time, I can also see many counterexamples. For example, to use again the air pollution case, so Beijing has done pretty well to improve the air quality. And in that sense, the territorial approach is really effective. But effective only in the short term. By short term, I mean in the last 3 to 5 years. So the air quality level has improved significantly. But in the long term, Beijing is not going to have blue sky if it doesn't collaborate with other provinces nearby, and also the civil society, environmental NGOs. So the city government itself, by itself, can't really improve the environment over the long term. I think one of the challenges for the city is to open up more space for other actors to participate. And for India, let me think what can be a good counterexample to show that the associational approach is not necessarily inclusive. So one of my case studies is on housing, the slum redevelopment. And if you look at, for example, just Mumbai, one city, the process has been hugely exclusive. Exclusive in the sense that if we look at the numbers, until today, still more than 50% of Mumbai's population lives in slums. So only a very small number of slums have been redeveloped. And for those slums that have been redeveloped, the residents actually didn't get a good deal. Not everybody was eligible for compensation, and even for those who are eligible, what they got is only a small apartment in they call it resettlement housing quarters. The construction quality is very poor, and maintenance fees are not affordable. So when I compare slums with urban villages in China, I think in many aspects, the urban villagers are actually doing much better than the eligible slum dwellers in Mumbai. So so my point is, we can generalize, but again, there are many counterexamples to show otherwise.
That's a point taken. If you'll allow me one more question. I was fascinated by the parts of the book where Indians compared themselves to the Chinese. These were some of my favorite and most compelling parts of the book for me. I'm thinking of the passage at the beginning of chapter 4, where a character from Aravind Adiga's novel, an Indian real estate developer, expresses envy of China's political willpower and laments India's weakness in comparison. Then again, in chapter 5, Indian environmental NGOs point to Beijing's success in reducing air pollution. And they propose Beijing, they propose the Chinese government as a model for the Indian government to emulate. I think there could be a whole book, or at least an article, just about these comparisons and how they're deployed on the ground. I wondered whether Chinese people are also comparing themselves to India and what they're using such comparisons to get at. And I wondered if you could talk about the conversation across countries, Chinese looking at Indians and Indians looking at Chinese, as in some ways, the two giants in the region, both developmental miracles in a way, and what they're saying about each other, and how those comparisons are being used on the ground. As for instance, environmental NGOs point to Beijing to get the government to do more.
Thank you. That's a great question. First of all, I think the bottom line is there's a lot of interest on in each other, but the interest is not the same. In general, I think Indians are much more interested in Chinese than the other way around. When I was doing field work in India, everywhere I went, people asked me how things work in China. What about this? What about that? But when I tell my Chinese friends that I'm writing a book comparing China and India, I get no response. Nobody asked me how things work in India. So, and that's just a personal example. And if we look at universities, institutions in India, there are many new foundations, think tanks, or institutes focusing on China studies. But on the Chinese side, there is none. There are experts in the IR field, international relations, but in general, there are very, very few Chinese academics who focus on domestic issues in India. So that's there's a lot of interest, but it's not symmetrical. But I think there are some changes, especially during perhaps after the pandemic. Before the pandemic, China, I think most young Chinese people only looked to the West, the United States, Europe, as for role models or for good best practices. They didn't have much interest in the global South, other developing countries. But over the last year, the whole world saw how US, especially US, has failed miserably in handling the COVID-19 pandemic. So that gave, I think at least in my circle, a lot of people are rethinking their view of the West. So I think there are two possibilities. One is China might, in the next few years, China might, at least for the middle class Chinese, they may pay more attention to other countries, not Europe, not the United States. But a second possibility is China might isolate itself more because China has done pretty well in handling the pandemic. So for a lot of people, they are so confident that they don't need to learn from other countries. So I hope it's the former, it's the first. Yes. So as you mentioned, there's a lot of linkages between the two countries. And for this book, I didn't trace those linkages. Maybe for the next project.
Perhaps, this topic is absolutely fascinating to me. And if this is the last question I have on paper, but if I can slip one more in that's related to what you just said, that occurs to me. So let me start with a comment that one of the characters makes in the Adiga novel that you quote in chapter 4. So the real estate developer, I believe, is talking about how fast developments get approved and how fast buildings go up in China. And he compares it to the experience of sex as a teenager. And it's this wonderful sense of, I can't believe that they work so fast over there. They do it, that they do it, without all the impediments that we as Indians have to face. And it's a very telling comment, and it reminds me of my own research on the Philippines and how the middle class look to China as well as Singapore as models. And so my question essentially is this: I wonder what effect these demonstrations, these regional comparisons are having on the political imaginations of some of the people in India, particularly, whether it's suggesting a way of thinking about governance that's not less democratic, perhaps. Just as, say, Filipinos are looking at Singapore or even China and saying, they can do things that we can't, and they can do them much faster. So maybe democracy isn't all it's cracked up to be. I wonder if the same kind of conversations are playing out in India, because the Chinese comparison seems, at least to many in the Indian middle class, so compelling on the ground. And perhaps it accounts for the turn rightward to Modi, to Hindu nationalism, to these kinds of things. Again, I know it's speculation, but it's just a fascinating current that's running through the book.
Right. I think for the intellectuals and professional class in India, they know very well the limitations of the Chinese model of economic growth. But while knowing the limitations, they are impressed, if I can use the word. So they are impressed by the achievement, what China built and how fast the economy has been developing. So they want to learn. They want to see what's actually going on and how different policy issues are negotiated, are managed, housing, infrastructure, environment. So that's my sense. Most people I talk to on the Indian side, they are very proud of their democracy, and they know the Chinese model is not sustainable. But at the same time, they want to learn what's going on in different parts of the country, and they have a strong interest in almost everything going on in China. So that's my short answer to your question.
Thank you, Shufei, and thank you for your remarkable book. Let's now turn to questions from the audience, and I'll serve as moderator. So I'm going to read out in order questions in the Q&A box. So let me start. So a question first from Kristen Stapleton. I'm simply going to read it verbatim. Thanks for the interesting talk. I haven't read the book yet, but plan to do so. Do you see a difference in China and India between the emotional connections or identification of policymakers with the cities where they work? And this is a question from Kristen Stapleton, History Department, University of Buffalo SUNY.
I'm also reading the question, emotional connections of policymakers with the cities where they work. Too bad we can't talk directly to the audience. So let me maybe try to understand what emotional connections mean. I can give a couple of examples. Let me go back perhaps to the housing example on urban villages in Guangzhou. So in general, if I can generalize, the villages in the south of the country are much more powerful than the north part of the country. They can actually negotiate and bargain with the city officials for better compensation. And then now I'm coming to the part on emotional connections of local officials. So one small piece of the puzzle is the local officials in the south are actually locals. They speak Cantonese. They are from the same Pearl River Delta region. So they are very different from the mayors, for example, in Beijing, the mayors of Beijing, the mayors of Shanghai, who are all appointed, have always been appointed from other places. So the mayors of Beijing and Shanghai are not local. And therefore, they don't have the deep connection to the cities they actually govern. And for Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and most cities in the south, the officials are local, and therefore they have a very probably they have a more humane or civilized or conciliatory approach when they actually negotiate with the residents. So I do see the difference in this regard between the northern part of the country and the southern part of the country, if I can use that as an example.
Shufei, I just want to add that Kristen Stapleton clarified her question a little bit. And let me just read out the bit, it's at the very bottom of the Q&A box. Chinese officials are responsible to the center, not to the locality. So the emotional connections are different, probably.
Right, yes. So the local officials are not accountable for the residents in their cities. And that's why for many things, they just don't care because they don't get elected. There are no municipal elections. There are elections, but only in the villages. But they can get promoted and also demoted by the provincial and central government officials. And therefore, they probably attention to what's going on in the central government and also the provincial government. So I agree with you.
Let me move on to the next question. This one's by from Sayoni Boss. In the case of Singler, the territorial logic of the West Bengal state government was very apparent, though the local administrative and panchayati system did not play a crucial role, but the territorial push came from the state government. This was also the case in Nandigram, East Mendinipur district in West Bengal. Hence the broad generalization that in India, associational is really contingent, as territoriality of states can be seen, although coming from a higher scale of the state and not from the local scale. Further, this territorial power exercised by the various Indian states vis-a-vis land grabs varies from state to state in India. Your comments?
Yes. So there's a very developed, very strong and large literature on regional variations in terms of land protests, land disputes in India. And I'm sure the West Bengal example doesn't represent the rest of the country. For one thing, West Bengal was ruled by a communist party for almost 30 years. So that changed or made it different, probably an outlier that made the state of West Bengal quite different from the rest of the country. So I agree with you that there's a lot of variations in India, and also the same thing for China. Both countries are large and complex. And for the book, I picked only 2 sites, one from each country, and I don't think these 2 specific land disputes actually represent what's going on in terms of peasant struggles in the country as a whole. And for the Chinese case, Wukan protest is probably one of the few successful examples, successful in terms of, in the sense that the local villagers actually got some of their land back. And for most other protests, the locals were just cracked down, repressed by the authorities. So there's a lot of variations within each country.
Thank you. Next question from Meipeng Shen, Trinity College. My question for Shufei is, do you think socialism plays a factor in China's territorial mode of governance? If so, how?
Oh, that's a short question, but very big, big question. Yes, definitely. So my short answer is yes. Socialism. China was a socialist country for years, and so some of the territorial institutions that are very effective today are actually inventions of from the socialist era. For example, the hukou system. So the hukou system has a very long history dating back to the 13th century, but it's only in the 1950s that the hukou system was institutionalized. So that's one legacy of socialism. What else? And another example can be the decentralization of power from central to municipal governments. So that's another legacy of socialism. When the Communist Party came to power, one of the first things they did was to appoint party officials to take charge in local municipal governments. So that's the first stage in the empowerment of local municipal institutions. So, so my short answer is yes, there's a lot of legacies from socialism, and many of the territorial institutions that are still powerful today are actually products from that era.
Next question from Guangzhi Huang. Do you see any regional differences in China in your research when it comes to the application of this territorial model? Is Guangzhou or Guangdong unique because we have read a lot about how house owners from that province successfully stave off land grabs?
Regional differences in China. I think there are, if I can simplify my answer, there are 2 parts to the question. If you look at how policies are implemented, there's a lot of variations, so a lot of regional differences. But the general patterns remain the same. For example, if we look at how China has been trying to control the pandemic, the approach is quite territorial. So for every city, the city is divided into small units, small cells, and in Chinese it's called Wangge. It's translated into English as grid. It's called the grid governance system. So for each cell, which is about 1 or 2 square kilometers, the municipal government would appoint different people to take charge of contact tracing and also quarantine. So that's a very territorial way to try to reduce the number of infections. And that is being done all over the country, not only in cities, but also in villages. And I think that's a very good example of the territorial thinking of managing the COVID-19 pandemic. But if we look at the implementations, there's so many variations depending on the local situation, also how capable the local officials are, and how willing the local residents are, how they want to, how willing the locals, let me go back, how cooperative the locals are. So there's a lot of differences across regions. So that's the second part
Shifei,
to a question.
if I might add to that question very briefly, you talked about how China's relying on territorial mechanisms to address the pandemic. I wonder if you'd also say that in the Indian case, associational tactics or an associational logic is apparent in their attempts to contain the pandemic.
So for the if we think about the pandemic, there's for India, there's first a lot going on. I wouldn't simplify it as just only associational approach to governing or managing the pandemic. So the first, if we look at the period of last April, a lot of migrant workers in India were trying to get back to their hometowns. They were stuck in cities, and the government was really late in their response. So one of the most active actors is actually the NGOs, different charity groups. So maybe that's an example of the associational approach to managing the situation. But I wouldn't simplify it that way, because the Indian government has always been, also been quite involved. Also, there's the police, the Indian police, villages, there are village panchayats. So there are different actors in at play.
Okay. Next question. This one's from Kevin Gao. Thank you, Dr. Ren, for the talk. My question is about environmental governance beyond air pollution. China, since 1949, has built a large number of dams across the country. When a dam project is initiated in the rural area, does the local government also play a decisive role in managing the project? Second, in nowadays China, what hinders Chinese NGOs in making a change in environmental activism?
So let me address the second question first. What hinders Chinese NGOs in making a change in environmental activism? I think the answer is the government. So China has a lot of NGOs in every sector, environment, but also labor rights, health, women's rights, many new NGOs. But their activities are quite limited because they can't say or do anything that angers the government. If they do that, they will be shut down. So that's just the reality. Very unfortunate, but that's the situation. Has been the situation for a very long time. Let me just read the first question. When a dam project is initiated in rural areas, does the local government also play a decisive role in managing the project? I'm not sure what specific examples you have in mind. So it really depends on the scale of the infrastructure projects. So for smaller scale infrastructure projects, the local governments can pretty much decide on everything from the initial planning to execution. But for larger scale infrastructure projects, such as big dams, Three Gorges Dam, the local governments probably are minor actors because a lot of things are decided provided by the central government, funding, planning, relocation, resettlement. So I would say it's case by case.
Next question is from Taiyu Yang. Before I go on to that question, I'd just like to solicit further questions from the audience as we approach wrap-up time. So if you have questions pending, please write them down in the Q&A box so we can get to them hopefully before time's up. So back to this question from Taiyu Yang, History Department, University of California, Irvine. Thank you, Professor Ren, for your fascinating talk. Just a quick question from a historical point of view. I'm wondering if there are any historical reasons, elements that could explain these two countries' different approaches to urban governance.
Okay, thank you for the question. So in the book, I actually have a chapter on the historical development of local governance. Not all, but some of the territorial institutions I examined can be traced far back in the history. I think I don't remember everything I wrote in that chapter, but I think I did a short review of the local governance systems in Quanzhou, in the south of the country, in China. For that community, the local gentry, Confucius gentry, was actually quite powerful. And so they were more powerful than the appointed officials, the county magistrates. So some of the territorial institutions and authorities can be traced back to beyond 1949. And for India, some of the associational types of governing techniques can be traced back to the colonial and pre-colonial period. Thank you for the question.
Next question from Holly Yu. Thank you, Dr. Ren. This is a very interesting topic, comparing the urban political systems between India and China. In your perspective, what is the most effective approach on the spectrum between territorial and associational, looking at examples in the world?
What's the most effective approach on the spectrum between territorial and associational, looking at the examples in the world? Wow, that's a very broad, broad question. I think the question overlaps a little bit with what Marco asked previously. How can we apply when we look at other countries? What can we say? Can we generalize? And my sense is, as I said previously, China and India are outliers. If you look at local spending, more than 60% of the total national expenditure in China is actually made by local governments. So that means local governments have a lot of power. And the number for India is only 4%. Less than 4% of the total national spending is made by local governments. That means local governments in India don't have much revenue, and without revenue, they can't do things. So, and in that sense, these are two opposite examples, two extremes. And most other countries are probably somewhere in the middle. And in terms of effectiveness, again, I think it depends on what time period we are looking at. Some territorial approaches can be very effective, but only in a limited region or within a limited time period. And over the long term, if we take a longer view, we may see a lot of limitations for each approach.
Thank you, Shifei. I wonder if I could tag one of my own questions to this.
Sure, yes.
I'd like to ask about how, in your experience, Chinese, since part of your work is ethnographic, how Chinese people are evaluating the territorial approach in general, and whether the evaluation has more to do with, well, this could be more efficient or more effective, or whether there are demands or a desire for greater inclusivity, for perhaps the word democracy is too loaded, but for a kind of association for a kind of associational model, a little bit like India, whether there's any desire for that, or is it really just for more effective governance?
I think the answer can be very complicated here. I would agree with you if we look at the period until COVID-19 hit. A lot of middle-class Chinese were not happy about where the country was going, and there are civil society actors who wanted more openness, more to operate, operate to do what they want to do. And there's a lot of anger about the way how China has changed over the last 7 years under Xi Jinping's administration. So Google has been banned, a lot of social media, internet websites, the censorship has become so strong that so people the educated urban middle class was getting desperate, and some of them decided to go abroad to leave the country. So that was the situation before the pandemic hit. But for the last 12 months, from January 2020 until now, I think there's some change going on for the among the educated urban middle class. And a lot of people are thinking right now that the Chinese model is actually not that bad. Sure, we don't have freedom, but we also don't have 200,000 new infections every day. So when they compare with Europe, United States, they can see, if I can use the word benefit, the benefit of being under a single party rule. So I think there's a lot of changes in the way how people think about the country, the leadership over the last year.
I find that extremely interesting. If I might ask you to parse that question, that answer a little bit more, and ask specifically how much of that has to do with a comparison between what's happening in the United States and what's happening in China versus an assessment of how the Chinese government handled the pandemic itself. In other words, is it a positive evaluation of the Chinese handling of the pandemic versus a negative evaluation of how the United States and other countries have been handling it?
Yes, precisely, yes. So people compare. So when people in China compare what's going on in the US, not only the pandemic, but also the politics, what happened in DC last week, it's shocking. So the more that they compare, perhaps for some people at least, the more they see how fortunate they are to live in a strong authoritarian country. The pandemic is not over yet. In yesterday's paper, so there's a big story about a new wave of infections in North China, in Hebei province. So we will see what's going to happen in the next few months.
So you're saying that both things are weighted equally, that both things affect each other and they're hard to separate, both what's happening there and what's happening in China.
Right, the contrast between the situation in China and then everywhere else in the world.
Yeah, I fear that it's not just China that's evaluating things comparatively this way. I mean, this is true also in the Philippines. People are looking at how the US government is handling the pandemic and saying maybe there are better ways to do this, which require different kinds of governments. And so it sounds like it's wider than just China, but it's a bad omen, perhaps. Last call for questions. Before I turn it over to Paul Chaffee, do you have concluding comments that you'd like to add?
No, I just want to say thank you to the organizers at the Center for East Asian Studies at U of C, and also at the Seminary Co-op. As I said at the beginning of my talk, the project was conceived right here in Hyde Park. And I'm very happy to give a talk today to the audience at U of C. I know there are people zooming in from other regions, other states, but this is a happy ending to give a presentation to my local community. Thank you for listening.
It's your hometown in a way. Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to Paul Kopp from the Seminary Co-op.
Well, thank you to our panelists, to Xuefei and Marco, and thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. We hope that you enjoyed tonight's program. For more information on upcoming book talks that are part of the East Asia by the Book CEAS Author Talk series, please visit the CEAS website. A link will be placed in the chat box for your reference. As a reminder, we encourage you to subscribe to CEAS emails so that you can receive additional information on events related to East Asia. Thank you again and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Paul and Marco.
Thank you, Xuefei. Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.